Hey everyone, Anark here, and today we're going to talk about the philosophy of Stoicism, mostly from a left perspective. However, I imagine whether you're left or right, you already have some preconceptions about Stoicism. Stoicism is often viewed as being very conservative, promoting rugged individualist values. In a broad cultural sense, Stoicism is viewed as being about suppressing one's emotions, about being numb. Leftists often see it as a philosophy which promotes drawing inwards and not concerning oneself with political causes. For that reason, marble statue avatars and right-wing influencers are much more likely to come to mind when Stoicism is mentioned than anarchism, but the foundations of Stoicism might surprise you. And when we understand Stoicism as a philosophy better, we discover something that's much more subtle and universal than many right-wing adherents would propose. Indeed, even if you don't want to become a Stoic by the end of this video, I think it will give you some food for thought on how to live a better life. So stick around if that sounds interesting, because that's going to be the topic of our video today. So, what is Stoicism? Stoicism is a school of Greek and later Roman philosophy, which is focused on how to live a good life. And that wasn't unique among the Greeks. In fact, Greek philosophy was primarily concerned with how to live a good life, but what characterizes Stoicism is its emphasis on how to deal with the difficulties in life. And that makes sense when you consider the founder of Stoicism, the Greek philosopher Zeno of Citium. But Zeno was not always a philosopher. Earlier in his life, he was actually a merchant. In his early 20s, he was making his way back home with a shipment when a storm shipwrecked his boat, and that destroyed his entire livelihood. It plunged him into poverty, but he began his journey into philosophy. He later said, "I made a prosperous voyage when I suffered shipwreck." This is because after the shipwreck, he didn't try to return to the life of a merchant. Zeno went and learned about every school of philosophy at the time, even studying under the Cynic philosopher Crates of Thebes. In fact, Stoicism is probably most influenced by Cynicism. However, we found that Cynicism still didn't quite get it right. Whereas Cynicism told people to remove themselves from political life, he believed in the concept of a civic duty. And like a lot of other Greek philosophers, he believed in a virtue ethics, but he just thought that they had way too many virtues to keep track of. He thought that they needed to simplify the number of virtues. So Stoicism is a philosophy based around the cultivation of 4 key virtues. And those key virtues are wisdom, self-discipline, often called temperance, justice, and courage. So the first one on the list, wisdom, isn't only knowledge, which people absolutely should cultivate, but it's also good reasoning. It's caring about the truth and logic, but also absorbing deeper lessons about life. Self-discipline, or temperance, isn't about receiving external discipline, but instead about the cultivation of self-control over one's actions and consistency in one's behavior. It's also about good judgment, not falling victim to stereotype or knee-jerk, but understanding situations within their context. The third one, justice, isn't associated with the legal concept of justice. It's instead about treating others fairly and honestly, about fulfilling one's duties to others, and in recognizing the common humanity of all other people. And the last one on the list, courage, is the facing of fear and hardship and overcoming them. Courage is also at the root of perseverance. It's the willingness to endure difficulties and to speak truth to power. In the view of the Stoics, these 4 virtues are what it means to live a good life. not health or wealth or community or any other worldly factor. This isn't to say that those aren't desirable. It's instead to say that if one doesn't cultivate the virtues, all those other good things still won't lead to a good life. These virtues also can't be cultivated alone. To be wise is also to be just, because wisdom cultivates one's discernment between good and bad. It takes courage to carry out what one knows to be just, and it takes self-discipline to abide by your principles. To be unjust is therefore to be unwise, cowardly, and lacking self-discipline. To be courageous, one must also be self-disciplined, because self-discipline is what allows one to practice courage in the face of terrible obstacles. One must also be wise in order to know what values to discipline oneself toward, and just in the adherence to our principles. There are all kinds of examples given in the literature, but for now I want to move on to another one of the key principles of Stoicism that I think is very valuable, and that is the separating of what one can control from what one cannot control. And the Stoics always try to remind us to focus our minds on that which we can control. When we focus ourselves on what we can't control, we're always made miserable because we're vesting our emotional well-being in the outcome of a thing which moves with or without our approval, a thing that we can't even stop at our own will. In fact, the Enchiridion, which is a book, which is a sort of like summary of the thoughts of Epictetus, who is a Stoic philosopher, opens with the line, "Some things are in our control and others are not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, property, reputation, command, and, in one word, whatever are not our own actions." And this principle, to be fair, I think this is where the misconception that Stoicism is like apolitical or only focused on the individual comes from. I think a lot of people hear that and they assume that that means that you don't control any of the world around you, therefore you shouldn't worry yourself with politics or social structures or injustice. However, in practice, the Stoics have never been the sorts to shrink from political engagement. People who have been rich and poor, people who've been powerful and marginal, have all found lessons in Stoicism. In fact, it's named as it is because the Stoa, which were the porches, were these public areas where they could preach to people. I mean, think about the fact that Marcus Aurelius, who was the emperor of Rome, was a Stoic. Think about the fact that Seneca, an advisor to Nero, was a Stoic. There are fair criticisms to be had of the last two figures there especially, but it's hard to square that observation with the idea that the Stoics are all about political disengagement. So with that in mind, how do we square this all together? How does it make sense that we have to have that separation, and yet the Stoics do not advocate us removing ourselves from broader social problems? Well, I think the important thing to understand here is that this is not a denial that we have an ability to interact with the world. It's simply re-emphasizing that that interaction always takes place through our bodily capacities. So like, for example, you might say that you have control over your lamp, but the only way that you exert control over the lamp is by using your body. You reach your hand out and you click the switch and the lamp turns on. Or you might say that you have like control over other people's perceptions of you, but in reality, all you really have control over is how you present yourself and how you speak to others. You have control over your own actions. You have control over the way you dress or the things you say, but you don't actually have control over how they ultimately do perceive you. And I think that this is a really important thing to understand. It's sort of at the center of the Stoic philosophy. When we confuse our own scope of control, we are almost always going to be frustrated by the lack of control of those external things. And if not frustrated, we're going to be confused or depressed or whatever it is. So for example, if you think you actually have control over the lamp, then you're probably going to be frustrated when you reach out to turn it on and the bulb doesn't work or the wiring has gone bad or something. And likewise, if you think you have control over the perceptions of others, you're going to be really frustrated when you find that people are spreading rumors about you or telling lies about you. That's something that you don't have control over. All you have control over is your own actions. You don't have control over how they ultimately then act after those actions. To prevent that frustration, to prevent that hopelessness, that despair, the Stoics are trying to remind us to always return our minds to that which we do control, and not those things outside of ourselves that we do not control. The Stoics are trying to get us to internalize what psychologists call an internal locus of control, which is something that I actually brought up in the Healthy Masculinity video, if people might recall. This isn't a denial that outside forces affect us. It's a reminder that those outside forces can only be changed by our conscious and deliberate actions, and by us taking responsibility for what our actions affect. This, when combined then with the Stoic virtue of justice, that creates a politically active orientation. Remember that you can't live a good life with just 3 of the 4 virtues. Someone cannot be properly self-disciplined, wise, and courageous who ignores justice. So, with that in mind, let's return to what the Stoic conception of justice is. And the first thing I want to say is that this is not just a personal conception of justice, and it is not a legal conception of justice. That is to say, justice is not just what is law. Justice is actually a social phenomena in Stoicism. It's related to this word oikeiosis. And oikeiosis actually shares etymological roots with words such as economy, ecology, and household. It's basically a philosophy of affinity based on closeness. There was a Stoic philosopher named Hierocles, which actually expanded on this concept of oikeiosis, and he did so by creating what he calls circles of concern. And these circles are the self, the family, fellow citizens, countrymen, and then humanity as a whole. So you can see here the diagram on screen. And might I add, it probably looks familiar because it is very similar to the circles of social consideration heat map meme that keeps getting passed around on the internet. So I guess you might say that Hierocles has a take on that circles meme that keeps going around. And that is that yes, the first thing a human develops is their own sense of self, and therefore a sense of self-preservation. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, the consideration of the self and the needs of the self are an integral part of survival. In fact, they're a really important part of Stoicism. However, the belief of the Stoics is that what makes one wise is the expansion of those circles of concern, and as he said, dragging the outward circles inwards. That is to say, treating the people at the most outward circles as just the same as the self or as one's family. This is what wisdom and reason might suggest. In fact, Stoicism has been described as valuing cosmopolitanism as its principle of justice, and you can find conservatives and fascists throughout history talking about how much they despise cosmopolitanism. So this really undercuts the right-wing claim that Stoicism is a fundamentally conservative philosophy. Conservative ideology, which views the individual and the family as the most important circles, is fundamentally at odds with the Stoic virtue of justice. So then the Stoics aren't telling us to flee from the political world, and they're not denying that outside forces affect us. They're telling us that if we want to change the world, we have to make ourselves capable of it, while at the same time doing our best to expand our circle of affinity and kinship to all other human beings. So next, let's address another claim that people usually have about Stoicism, and that is that it wants us to suppress our emotions. However, the Stoics don't advocate the suppression of emotion. What they advocate is emotional control. Stoics view emotions as signals which carry information about the world, and they implore us not to let those emotions take control of our actions. And this is a really important distinction. There's a difference between feeling an emotion and acting on it. So take anger, for example. Anger is conveying important information to us. Anger is an emotion that we feel when we have some sense that there is an injustice. However, it's important that we control our actions when we feel anger. When there is injustice, we should ask how we can correct that injustice. However, when we let anger drive our actions, we're prone to destroying things without careful consideration of the outcomes. What if we perceive something wrong? What if our anger drives us to harm innocent people? These are things that happen when we let anger take the steering wheel in our minds, rather than simply letting it inform our actions. Sadness is another good example. Sadness is an indication that something is wrong in our lives. It's an indication that we are not having some kind of need fulfilled. However, when we let sadness drive our actions, we often do things which exacerbate all of the problems in our lives. What good does spiraling for days and days or weeks really do us? What if our sadness drives us to selfishness or disregard for our own health? This is what the Stoics mean when they say that our emotions should be felt and processed, but that they shouldn't direct our actions. Our rationality, informed by our emotions, should direct our actions. So now I'd like to return to Zeno of Citium. A lot of Zeno's works have actually been lost to history. All we have left of them are fragments and secondhand accounts of what was being said in those pieces. However, it's interesting because one of the most important of his pieces was called Republic, which is to say it was a critique of Plato's Republic. And in it, we find a Zeno that is certainly not this conservative, individualistic lover of domination that so many modern right-wing Stoics are. In fact, it seems that Zeno's main criticism of Plato was that Plato wanted to order society by domination. And Zeno apparently thought that the ideal society was essentially one where everybody opted into that society, that they came to it as immigrants, per se, and that they essentially opted into living virtuous lives as Stoics. So he thought that it was much better to have a society based on consent than a society based on order by domination. And it's interesting because Zeno was openly admitting that what he was envisioning was a utopia, but he was using it as a way to understand that ideal society. He laid out a society that was mediated entirely by the virtue of individuals, a society filled with Stoics. And it might shock a lot of right-wing Stoics to hear it, but he believed in equality of the sexes, abolition of nationalism, abolition of slavery, and abolition of all rulership. He believed that worship of God should not be confined to the temples, but that the divine was all present and therefore accessible to all people. For good measure, he also believed in polyamory. When you consider this all together, you get a Stoicism that is a lot closer to anarchism than it might appear at first glance. For Zeno, the individual wasn't the end of the story. The individual was part of a rich social tapestry. Zeno recognized that a society based on coercion was negative, that was not a good thing, that a society based on consent, a society where all things were held in common, was a much better society. And this stood at odds with the majority of the philosophers of his time. Another thing to note is that Zeno, despite being a merchant early in life, was absolutely not an elitist in his practice either. In fact, Zeno, by the end of his life, had been very successful and had created a sort of school of Stoic philosophy. And by the end of his life, he had two disciples who were named Cleanthes and Ariston. And Ariston was sort of a classical polymath. He knew everything about all of the philosophies of the Greek schools at the time, and he was kind of seen as the one who was favored to become the head of the school after Zeno died. By contrast, Cleanthes was working class. He watered the gardens of the rich. He was a wrestler. He was humble and hardworking. And interestingly, Zeno, close to his death, chose Cleanthes over Ariston. And this may sound like it would be a big risk, but Cleanthes was actually responsible for the long-term proliferation of the Stoic school of philosophy. He grounded Stoicism in practice, not just ideas. Also, remember how I mentioned the Stoa of Stoicism, where it got its name? It's really important to note that that was a public meeting place. At that time, a lot of the Greek schools were on gymnasia, which were essentially places where people went to work out, and gymnasia didn't let women go on to the site. So most Greek schools of philosophy could not be attended by women. It was basically only the Stoics and the Epicureans for which women could attend at the time of Zeno of Citium. It would become a little more normal in the Hellenist era that would follow, but he was actually living at the end of the classical era of Greece. So with all this in mind, the concept of Stoicism as being reserved for men and for rugged individualists is obviously completely wrong. That is a bastardization of Stoicism. Stoicism absolutely is not conservative. In fact, its entire history, it has essentially been a cosmopolitan, ethical virtue system. It has been a system which attempts to help people during hard times get through those hard times. It helps them cultivate the skills that are needed to succeed even when everything around them is scary and difficult. It is not a rugged individualist system, and it does not teach people to suppress their emotions. These are all stereotypes of Stoicism, which I think are really harmful, given that Stoicism actually has a lot of really good things to teach people. As for myself, I don't know if I would call myself a Stoic, but I certainly do get a lot out of Stoicism. I go back and I read the Enchiridion pretty regularly. I highly recommend that if you're looking for a text. And I think that it is very valuable to always be reminding yourself of what you control and what you do not control. Because what it's going to do is it's going to push you towards cultivating a better self, and a self that is able to actually confront the obstacles of the world. It's also going to help you not be so distressed by all of the things that you actually have no effect on, which are very distressing, things that are going to make you feel very nihilistic and hopeless. It's very good to remind yourself that those are things you do not need to focus your mind on. You need to focus your mind on what you can control. And then, once you have become capable, once you've become competent, once you have lots of power to affect other people, then you can actually focus your mind on those terrible things that you were worrying your mind about beforehand but had no control over. I also think it is very valuable for people to be focusing on self-discipline and perseverance and cultivating willpower during difficult times, and we are absolutely in difficult times. So even if you don't want to consider yourself a Stoic, which is perfectly fine, I think there are a lot of very valuable lessons for you to take out of this philosophy. And I really wanted to present a fresh take on Stoicism as a philosophy to help other leftists and especially other anarchists to recognize that it is absolutely not a right-wing or fascist ideology. It has essentially been co-opted by right-wingers. And you might be asking, what kind of resources can I seek out if I want to learn more about Stoicism, but I don't just want to dive into texts right now? You might be thinking that there are no non-right-wing Stoic resources for you to go to, but I'd like to recommend that you go and you subscribe to the YouTuber Ryan Holiday, who's actually now written numerous books on Stoicism as well. Ryan has demonstrated a lot of courage and wisdom in resisting audience capture by a lot of right-wingers. He has several million subscribers, and yet he has not caved to that large constituency of conservative Stoics. And I don't know what his particular political perspectives are, but I know that he has upheld justice in his actions. And I think that is very impressive given the position that he has as being a Stoic YouTuber. You have to know that the pressure is there for him to concede to a sort of toxic right-wing Stoic masculinity. He has remained a very virtuous person in difficult circumstances. And I think y'all should go over there and follow him because he probably has a lot to teach everyone. So I hope that was helpful for you, and I hope you took away some lessons that you can apply to your life. If you liked the video, you should go down and click like. If you have thoughts, you should go down there and comment, tell me what you think. Also, if you want to support the channel, just want to ask you to go over to my Patreon and become a patron for any amount. That would be enormously helpful for me, especially as we are having difficult economic times. I also just want to remind you that you can see behind me here that there is now a part 4 of A Modern Anarchism published in physical format. And if you'd like a copy, you should just get a hold of me in DMs or on Discord or anywhere that you can, and we'll talk about how I can ship you a copy of it. I have several copies of all 4 parts now. So for anybody that's interested, just reach out and we'll talk about how that I can get a copy to you. I'm currently selling them for about $10 each. So just reach out to me if that sounds like a good deal. In any occasion, I think that's it for this video. I'll see y'all next time.